You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Greg Shill, professor of law at the University of Iowa, and Jonathan Levine, professor of urban regional planning at the University of Michigan, to talk about their paper, First Principles of Transportation Law and Policy. Stay with us. Build more vibrant, equitable, and sustainable cities with your Executive Master of Urban Planning from USC Price. Designed for seasoned professionals from both inside and outside the planning field, the 16-month online Masters allows you to earn your degree while you work. Build hands-on skills to help you tackle challenges in urban planning, real estate project analysis, and public policy. For more information, visit priceonline.usc.edu. That's priceonline.usc.edu. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon supporters, past, present, and future. We really can't thank you all enough for the support, whether you've supported for a month or over 5 years. Join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards and support Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. $2 a month gets you stickers, including our Cars Are Cholesterol sticker and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks everyone from the advocates to the bus drivers that support this show. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire to support. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also get our transportation scarves, sign up for our daily newsletter started in 2006, or get our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice by going to theoverheadwire.com. Also, in the show notes, you'll find links to the bookshop.org affiliate store and link to purchase some of our Cars Are Cholesterol merch designed with the great help of Richard Wazensky. Follow him on Instagram at DickDavidSketches if you get a chance. Thanks for all your support, and we look forward to sharing with you what's next. Well, Greg Shill and Jonathan Levine, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourselves? We'll start with Greg and go with Jonathan.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be back with you. I'm a law professor at the University of Iowa, where I study transportation law and policy, as well as business law.
And I'm on the faculty of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Michigan. That's in the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. And I study transportation and land use planning. Greg and I met at a conference in Ann Arbor, and we realized that we have a lot of shared interests.
I can tell from your writing and your books and listening to your episodes of Densely Speaking as well. And Greg, we had you on the show literally right before lockdowns. We were at Manny's in the Mission with the Urban Environmentalist Group for YIMBY Action, and I interviewed you on stage, and we were surrounded by people. And before that, we were all kind of penned into this room, close to each other. And I remember feeling a little bit nervous about that because we had heard about all the stuff going on. And then we sat outside for a burrito afterwards, which was really fun too. But that was interesting that you were the last person I talked to live before we went into lockdown and disappeared from the earth almost.
That was a fun moment. Well, it was a fun event and fascinating in retrospect. But it was all safe because we used a lot of Purell at the time.
That's right. It was all safe. And we had no idea that was airborne.
Exactly.
And Jonathan, we haven't had you on to chat with us yet, but you were featured as part of a crossover with the Densely Speaking podcast on episode 310. But I just want to say, Jonathan, that Zoned Out actually is one of my first blow my mind books. I just really appreciated reading that back in 2005 or so. And we actually mentioned it in passing as well when we had Nolan Gray on the show a couple of weeks ago or a couple months ago. So I hope folks read it if they get a chance, because it's really one of those books that when you read it, you're like, oh, that makes so much sense. And thinking about how places like San Jose do things versus Greece, et cetera, those things stick in my mind. So I really appreciate that.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the plug. And I want to note how much the world has changed since I wrote Zoned Out. When I wrote Zoned Out, I was essentially writing against a mindset that equated policy reform with intervention into markets. So anytime anybody said, well, we need more compact cities, the question became, oh, you want to intervene into markets, what's the justification? And people didn't understand at the time that markets in so many ways want to produce denser development, want to produce more mixed use development, and are thwarted by land use regulations. That really has shifted quite remarkably in the intervening years.
The amount that people understand it now, I imagine.
Understand that,
yeah.
Yes. And understand the extent to which land use regulation is an impediment on choice, is an impediment on affordability, and is even an impediment on sustainability.
So in episode 280, when Greg was on the show, we asked you how you got into planning. And Jonathan, I wanted to ask you how you got into cities and urban planning.
Well, public transportation changed my life. I was a kid growing up in suburban San Francisco, Castro Valley, the East Bay, when BART hit. So I was in high school. I had been spending hours and hours taking buses through clogged city streets to visit my buddies who tended to live in Berkeley and San Francisco. And suddenly there was public transportation that actually provided a reasonable level of service. And I realized as a suburban kid that this is awesome. And it gives me a lot of choices that I didn't have before and makes my life a whole lot more convenient. I think that was a big part of why I ended up in transportation. Why I ended up in planning, I realized that I was interested in environmental issues. Started out, actually did an undergrad in the College of Natural Resources at UC Berkeley, but came to realize that where the action is not with the birds and the bees, but how humans interact with the natural environment and how the built environment and the natural environment interact.
Castro Valley, that's really interesting. You know what popped in my head when I
You're
heard...
actually the first person who said that it is, but okay.
Well, the first thing that popped in my head is A Man in Full by Tom Wolfe. I don't know if you've ever read that novel, but there's...
I did. I don't remember Castro Valley in there.
Yeah, so there's one section of the book that talks about Castro Valley, and the other section of the book talks about Atlanta, and they kind of come together in the end. But there's a guy that works at a plant, and he lives in Castro Valley, and it talks about, Tom Wolfe's, the book is basically about growth machines.
Yes.
And it's really interesting. But Castro Valley is one of the main characters in terms of the place.
The other thing we're famous for is Rachel Maddow grew up in Castro Valley.
Lots of famous things from the Bay Area specifically, I'm sure. So let's talk about the paper. First Principles in Transportation Law and Policy. What brought you all together to write this piece?
So, I was excited to collaborate with Jonathan on this. We'd had some conversations about how to fuse our interests and background in law and policy. And I think it's really critical to lay the groundwork on some of the questions that are freely debated in the transportation space, but often in my view, somewhat unmoored fashion, unmoored from some of the underlying purposes of transportation. And I think when we articulate what those purposes are and differentiate the purposes of transportation from the side effects or externalities of transportation, some of which are good, some of which are bad, it's just easier to then think about how to prioritize these things, which isn't to suggest that we have an off-the-shelf, solution that's going to work for people with every type of normative perspective. But we try to, organize that debate a little bit more, in my view, rigorously, so that we can have more productive debates about these contested issues.
And let me tell you what I saw in Greg. Greg is really a pioneer in creating a field of transportation law that goes beyond traditional issues of the law of trucking and the law of railroads, but to fuse urbanism and transportation law. So much of the obstacles that we face in transportation policy don't have to do with knowledge. They have to do with institutions and legal, first and foremost, of those institutions. So I think bringing together institutional legal knowledge together with substantive planning expertise is really what drew me to this partnership.
So one of the things we talk about on the show a lot is access to destinations and how a lot of transportation policy is based on getting people through places rather than to places. Why is access so important to call out from the start? Because you call this out as kind of the main theme, actually, is getting people to places where they want to go.
It's about avoiding perverse outcomes. When we judge success with metrics of mobility, things like highway level of service or percent of time spent in congestion, we end up, ironically, viewing a situation where people spend more time and more money in transportation as a success as long as that travel is fast. Now, that's really counter to people's experience. When you and I think about why we travel, it's very rarely for the pleasure of movement. It's almost always to reach a destination. So destinations are right there at the center. And the idea of accessibility-based planning is aligning the procedures and perspectives and metrics of planning with what you and I and even the average person in the street knows to be the fundamental purpose of transportation.
I agree with that. Jonathan has another book called From Mobility to Accessibility, and that was being published around the time that we met. And that really opened my eyes to this concept of accessibility, which I think it's worth just disambiguating briefly for the audience. This is not accessibility in the kind of ADA sense. I mean, I think it has a familial relationship to that concept in that they're both about ensuring universal access, but accessibility, the way that urban planners talk about it and the way that Jonathan and his co-authors in that book talk about it, is about ensuring access to destinations. And, the last high-speed train I was on, I think it topped out at 300 kilometers an hour, and that was on an LED sign on the train. And, I took a selfie of myself with that, and I had a big grin on my face. It's certainly fun to go fast, but I think it's important to differentiate that really from the core purpose. I wasn't on the train for the purpose of going 300 kilometers an hour. If we're talking about isolated cases like drag racing or, time trial of some sort, then fine. But for the overwhelming majority of trips, even a Sunday drive is an uncommon phenomenon proportionally to the amount of trips and the distances that are traveled. So it makes sense, I think, to anchor the conversation in this concept of accessibility.
What accessibility does is it brings proximity into the equation. So mobility-based planning gauges the quality of transportation strictly on how easily one can move. But the problem is that's a poor metric for indicating how well one can reach one's destinations, because you can have high accessibility even if you can't move very fast if your proximity is high, if your destinations are close. Or alternatively, your destinations can be far away and you can move fast, but you still have low accessibility. So it's really only accessibility that gauges the value of the transportation and land use system to people.
How much has this discussion of accessibility changed over the last maybe 10, 15 years? Because it seems like there's more discussion about it now than maybe there was before.
Accessibility has been around for actually a century plus, and it's gone through a number of metamorphoses. I talk about the transformations from positive accessibility to normative accessibility. What I mean by that is many people who use accessibility use it to describe and analyze the world, which of course is a terrific role for accessibility. It's a good predictor of travel behavior. It's a good predictor of land value. But that's not the only value of accessibility. Accessibility has a normative dimension as well, and that is it is or ought to be the substantive goal of transportation planning and the transportation aspects of land use planning. I think that normative aspect has grown in recent years. So if you look at research from, let's say, the 50s and 60s and 70s, you'll find lots and lots of accessibility research, but it tends to focus on accessibility as a way of describing or analyzing the world rather than accessibility as a goal for transportation planning.
And Greg, you mentioned speed. I mean, there's a whole discussion now about 15-minute cities, 20-minute cities. There's a discussion about getting between here and there in a certain amount of time. Why is that not equated with accessibility? Why is that, being able to get somewhere in a certain amount of time not necessarily what you mean by accessibility?
Yeah, so accessibility really is about people being able to access destinations that they value in, with convenience, whether that means at a high rate of speed or in terms of travel speed or just in a small amount of time. Either way, really, the measurement is time and to some extent convenience. And then we can think about other dimensions like cost and safety. And so I think the 15-minute city concept gets at that very well. There's been different articulations of that concept. So, there are lots of threads to pull on. Can't really get a big, diversified, robust job market and all the other amenities people want, in a 15-minute city. But a 15-minute neighborhood where you can walk your child to school, pick up a cup of coffee, maybe grab some groceries on the way home, drop off your dry cleaning, et cetera, and maybe even walk to your office, depending on the type of work you have. That's more achievable. So I think, Jonathan can probably speak to this at a higher level of sophistication, but I'm certainly interested in taking, a look at some of the institutional legal barriers to enhancing, especially in this new world where we brought 40 years of trends towards remote work forward in a period of about 2 years, thinking about how to merge these concepts.
The 15-minute city is a pretty good encapsulation of the idea of local accessibility. or walking accessibility, or maybe cycling accessibility. But what also matters is regional accessibility. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine a job center that's 40 miles away and accessible only by car. And in your mind, pick up that major job center and move it to 20 miles away and still only accessible by car. That move wouldn't register within the 15-minute city. It's not a 15-minute job center. But that is a huge accessibility gain that center is not 40 miles away, but 20 miles away. So we have to think both at the dimension of what we can walk to and accessibility even for longer distances and even accessibility for destinations that we drive to. One of our philosophies is there is an accessibility and a mobility method for planning for any transportation mode, including walking. And you might say, what would a mobility method for planning for walking be? And I would say, well, read the Highway Capacity Manual, because their definition of walking level of service has everything to do with the ability of the pedestrian to move safely, to move comfortably, sure, but has nothing to do with the question of, is there anything you can actually walk to? So that actually is a mobility approach to pedestrianism.
I think sometimes for a given person in a given case, they might prioritize one over the other. And that's fine. The question is what, key performance indicators or what, metrics do we use generally to try to plan for greater accessibility rather than just planning for high speed movement. And one reason for that is along another dimension, which is the temporal dimension. So Jonathan is a professor at the University of Michigan. I grew up in Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is based. When I was a kid, and now I guess I'm going to date myself, but back in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't really rush hour in the conventional sense. There was more traffic around 8 or 9 and around 4 or 5 o'clock, but it wasn't like a big metro area rush hour. Today, my family who still live there, if they at all can, they avoid getting on the road at rush hour, certainly on the major roads, because the traffic backups are just unbelievable. And the reason for that is that the city itself has had relatively static population in the 30 plus years since that time. It's grown a little bit, but much less than national population, for example. But the number of jobs in Ann Arbor has exploded. It's one of these meds and ed, capitals that have created a lot of economic activity. And those people have to live somewhere. So they're living in bedroom communities that former farming towns that have become, and in some cases like Ypsilanti, industrial towns that have become de facto suburbs of Ann Arbor and the de facto affordable housing providers of Ann Arbor. And you might say, well, what's the matter with that? It's a good thing that land use evolves to accommodate changing preferences and so forth. And I'm all for that. But the particular challenge here, and there are some downsides, I think, on the sustainability side and other sides, but generally speaking, adaptation is fine and swell, but it's produced just an extraordinary boom in carbon emissions and traffic and a decrease in accessibility. And so that's the kind of thing that, frankly, if you're sitting there in 1990 and looking at these plans and these trends, you could probably project out in the absence of building up in Ann Arbor and adding mass transit options, which is what happened. In recent years, they have built a small number of taller buildings, but it's a little bit too late, and it's certainly too little, in my opinion.
You mentioned 3 ways indicators are used to measure transportation today in the paper. And I'm curious, how do we measure transportation today? And how is that different from, say, changing that to an accessibility focus rather than mobility focus?
The primary metric is level of service. So level of service is an A through F grade of transportation facilities that gauges their relative freedom from congestion, with the A being completely free and F being gridlocked. That rules the roost in so much transportation planning. It also rules the roost in a lot of land use planning, because a lot of land use planning is geared at an attempt, often a futile attempt, at maintaining intersection highway level of service. What would need to change is we don't throw that information away. We still need information about how the transportation system is performing in terms of movement, but we need to integrate that information with knowledge about proximity, because it's mobility and proximity together in various combinations that form the concept of accessibility. I'll give you an example. So let's say you're a developer and you're proposing an apartment building nearest the center of town, or maybe it's an apartment building near a transit station. And if you're listening to this podcast, you might say, oh gosh, my apartment building is going to be accessibility increasing. It gives people the ability to live close to their destinations or to live close to transit. The problem is you're going to be assessed by your city for your impact on car traffic. In other words, they're going to gauge, or actually they're going to make you pay for a consultant who's going to tell you how much your development is going to slow the traffic in the various intersections around the location. All that is important information, but it throws away the additional proximity that you're going to be bringing. So the recipe has to be keep the mobility information, keep level of service indicators, but analyze them in conjunction with metrics of proximity in order to gauge accessibility, not merely mobility.
I think that conjunction is really the key. And Jeff, you mentioned how KPIs make you think of Silicon Valley industries. To me, they brought to mind when I learned about them Moneyball, the central kind of thesis of which is that it's possible to look at a higher number of statistics. And baseball, of course, is a sport where there's a huge number of statistics, and people who are fans, really follow them and so forth, which is, it's not really necessarily the case for other sports to the same extent. So there's just a lot of data. And when you pair that with quantitative methods, you can gain some insights into who is adding the most value for the team, for example, even if they're not scoring a lot of runs. But it's not like the A's, who were the subject of that book, went out and tried to get people who were just really good only at one thing. I mean, they would emphasize different things for different positions and so forth. But the idea is that this is part of a team production process that yields wins, and that's the outcome variable that they want. And so the KPIs that they looked at are richer, and they are inputs, right? Like stealing bases is an input. That's not really an output. That's not the goal of the game, is not to steal a lot of bases, but it's a really important input. And movement at speed, mobility, could be an important input. It just all depends, right? And when you place that above all else, you really lose the forest for the trees. So that's what the accessibility focused critique of orthodox KPIs is coming from.
I love the Moneyball analogy, especially with the A's. It's funny. A lot of folks, and this is a tangent almost, but a lot of folks talk about, all the players that they had at that year, and not much mention of the amazing pitching that they had with Barry Zito and some other folks. But you all mentioned basically the three ways that the indicators can influence a process, which I think is really interesting too. During the planning process, after the fact to legally defend decisions, and then as benchmarks of understanding a problem such as congestion. So because they're so embedded in these processes and law, which is, I think, one of your kind of main focuses, how hard would it be to change them from mobility to access if in these three places where you can input, they are so embedded into the system?
It's a big question, and frankly, not one that we answer in a satisfying way in this project. We actually have another project that is more focused on that question, which is still in the works. But the short answer is, I think, they can be changed. To take the California context one more time, right? So CEQA has been a barrier to lots of reform at the transportation and land use interface. And the possibility of a new development causing local congestion right around that development was a sword that was used by opponents to stop projects. And that kind of converted CEQA to being a statute that was more helpful for preventing environmental reforms than for actually fostering them. So the legislature went and reformed that and took away congestion as a sword for NIMBY plaintiffs to lance projects. But we found that courts have still been willing to indulge basically substitute concepts of congestion, like crowding or a large number of people in a defined area, things that basically mean congestion. And so, there is a zombie property to these things, but I think if we can, try to talk about what KPIs are for, what they currently do. You folks were talking about the evolution of accessibility in the planning context, but these KPIs primarily don't come from planning, really, originally. They come from engineering, where knowing how fast the water is flowing through a pipe, yes, that's an input. What you want to know maybe is how fast is it coming out of the faucet, or is the homeowner satisfied with the water pressure, or something like that. That's really the output. But the one is a reasonably good proxy for the other. And so engineers traditionally focus on inputs for this reason, very quantifiable, more objective, more standardizable. And, we just don't think that speed in traffic in isolation is so valuable that it should be at the center of transportation and urban planning.
It's kind of a good news, bad news story. I'll start with the good news. Transportation planning and the transportation aspects of land use planning know very well how to incorporate methods, metrics, KPIs into their processes. So in a sense, every time you have a mobility metric, there is an accessibility analog. And from a technical standpoint, all it means is substituting in one metric or one objective function for another. So there's no real technical obstacle to that. The bad news is it's embedded in our system, mobility planning, in so many different ways. So in some cases, reform would be a matter of changing a municipal ordinance or changing a state law. Political obstacle, but not particularly sticky wicket. But in other cases, mobility planning is built into the assumptions of our system. So for example, city transportation directors will tend to follow engineering standards, even if those engineering standards are flawed and dangerous, frankly, because they're the best protection against getting sued. Or if they are getting sued, that's the best chance of winning. That's something that's not as easily remedied by a stroke of the legislative pen. So there are a number of these ways that mobility planning has insinuated itself into the system that is going to be harder to uproot.
I've often wondered why things like the Ashto Green Book are so embedded and not challengeable and used as just a way for, the status quo to continue versus, say, adoptions from the NACTO Guide and others.
I think there's a very clean institutional story for that frankly has a lot of justification. And that is that you have courts that are, for example, adjudicating a tort lawsuit by somebody who's injured on a road that's designed in a way that the three of us know maybe is dangerous, but that meets certain design criteria as articulated by the accepted organizations, professional organizations, right? Courts are very nervous to get into the business of second guessing experts in other domains. And so just across doctrines, way beyond transportation, think about medical malpractice or legal malpractice, the two high profile professional examples, really in many other areas as well. Courts really care about what is the standard, right? What is the norm here? Did they follow that? If they deviated, was that deviation the source of the harm here, or was it unrelated to the harm? And so showing that you met a standard is very good protection from that kind of a lawsuit. And that's for good reason, which is that courts are generalists, and they, especially where there is a well-established professional organization that has some kind of authority. In these cases, you have government agencies that are using these guides. In some cases, have guides of their own, like the MUTCD, that also prescribe certain standards. And so it makes sense to have standards that provide liability protection. I think the question then is, what is the content of those standards? The fact that we need those standards makes the content of the standards very important. And that's where the law and the policy meet.
Another dimension is funding. So many of our transportation projects at local levels have funding from state or federal levels, and often the state and federal funders will insist on designs according to the engineering standards. So this is another way in which the standards are locked in regardless of their quality.
Yeah, I just find that so interesting. And it's one of the things that struck me about the paper was this kind of zombie methods for keeping these systems alive that we know now are dangerous. So, road deaths, as you mentioned in the paper, and as we mention all the time on the show, are at 40,000 people a year. And, that's just an unacceptable number. But even though we know all the reasons why, many of the reasons why, not all of them, but many of the reasons why, larger cars, traffic, street design, things like that, we still can't seem to get anybody to pay attention to it. So, how is it that we can change that and make it so that, the Green Book or MUTCD, which is prescribing 85 percentile rules, is said to be wrong instead of the standard of the industry?
Ultimately, it's a hearts and minds game, meaning people have to become convinced that people and voters have to become convinced that this actually matters and matters to their lives. So the status quo is voters will tend to vote and support politicians who favor automobile movement. That's one of the ways in which efforts, for example, in California, where they eliminated congestion from the California Environmental Quality Act as a metric of environmental harm, it nonetheless comes back at the local level, municipal level, because municipal constituencies continue to insist on level of service metrics. So it's a matter of changing views. There's no big bad other. It really is us that is leading this.
It's also being sold to us, right? I think a quote in the book struck me, the Sunday drive, which Greg, you mentioned earlier, the Sunday drive, but the Sunday drive accounts for a trivial share of transportation trips compared with the daily commute, school run, shopping errand, care trip, and social call. And the first thing that popped in my head was car commercials, where all they're showing you is the Sunday drive. They don't show you any of the other trips, and maybe one or two do, but for the most part, they're selling you that Sunday drive rather than the trips that you take every day that accessibility would be important for.
On wonderfully open roads, of course.
In cities.
That's marketing. The cigarette companies aren't selling you lung cancer, and M&M's isn't selling you the consequences of eating a lot of M&M's. And that is what it is, and probably plausibly drives a higher level of consumption than it otherwise would. Otherwise, why would they be doing it? But also, I think consumers know that they're primarily not going to be buying a car for Sunday drives. And I guess I'm a little skeptical of that sort of lever for moving hearts and minds. I think I agree. Ultimately, it is a hearts and minds game, but that's true for any kind of reform agenda. And here, I think there are two, beyond the paper itself, there are two thoughts I have on that question. One is that, we should be thinking about how to make reform proposals more like round pegs. So it's just easier for municipalities and state agencies to use them from a liability protection standpoint. If they're just as good insulation from liability, then why not daylight that intersection? In fact, maybe you'll have fewer collisions and lawsuits, et cetera, to begin with. And, just worth noting that I think it was Federal Highway, were one of the modal agencies in the Obama DOT really kicked that off they published some guidance saying that the NACDO city design guide was perfectly adequate. There was some debate. This is like 10 years ago, a little bit of inside baseball, but there was some debate, I think, about whether cities could diverge from the MUTCD and the Green Book and so forth and use these NACDO guides. And so I think it was Federal Highway said, yes, you can. It would be appropriate. And so I'm not best positioned to know how big of an impact that specific reform had, but that type of thing, where reforms that favor accessibility become safe for planners to choose, that's helpful. And then the other thought is, where can we get reform that has a high expected value? So actually not systemic change, but more targeted changes that sidestep this political morass. And I have a recent separate thing that kind of focuses on that. And I think that concept is something that is worth thinking about. We've been in this systemic change, complete streets, safe systems mode for a long time now, and it's super important. But what else can we do that's actionable, in the next couple of years? And that I think is worth talking about.
I do think that change is possible. I've observed it myself. For example, I've observed city transportation engineers now talking about the goal of slowing traffic. And when I started hearing that, I said, wow, this isn't your father's city transportation engineer actually treating slowing traffic as a goal, and people accepting that. As an urban planner and researcher, I can't do too much about the advertisers. I might be able to do a little bit more about the planners and the engineers and the kind of language they supply to public debate. So currently they're supplying the language and the technical metrics that justify an autocentric view of the world, or historically. Can we change that via the norms of planning and engineering practice? I think we can a little bit.
I'm also somewhat optimistic. And one reason for optimism, as I see it, is the work from home revolution. It really is a general purpose technology that I think is going to have social as well as economic impacts for decades. And it's risky to be in the business of predicting the future. But one thing it logically does, if you are even working from home a few days a week, which is now the majority situation for college graduates in the United States who are employed, that they have a hybrid arrangement, suddenly your perspective becomes more local. And if people are speeding on your street, that was important to you before, but it's more important now. Conversely, the ability to go long distances quickly is probably a little bit less important than it was before. You have a smaller catchment area on a day-to-day basis for really the majority of the week, taking into account the weekend. And it's important to say this is a subgroup of the population, a privileged subgroup. And on the one hand, we don't want to organize our politics around a privileged subgroup of the population. At the same time, this is a group that has disproportionate electoral and economic power. And I think there's reason to believe that people fitting that mold are going to be more open to arguments about, for example, slowing traffic that is near them, understanding that there's a trade-off there. And that means that they can't get where they're going maybe as quickly as they would choose, but that there are going to be a lot of benefits. And so I think there may be a tailwind there that is really the flip side of the fact that cities and public transportation systems in big cities are in for a heap of trouble this decade because they serve commuters primarily.
Yeah, because they made that bet 20, 30 years ago, and that bet is coming back to haunt them a little bit. It's focusing on employment downtowns for the most part. I have a question for you all that I think you'll find interesting. What do you all mean when you say a need for measuring the success of outputs rather than inputs?
It goes back to the fundamental purpose of transportation. If we think of an analogy, what is the purpose of farming? Well, the purpose of farming is growing food, or at least one of the purposes of farming. The purpose of farming is not consuming fertilizer, even though fertilizer is a necessary input to the ultimate purpose of farming, which is growing food. So we wouldn't want to confuse the amount of fertilizer a farmer uses for the farmer's output. Similarly, we wouldn't want to confuse the amount of mobility that there exists in a city or in a region for people's ability to reach destinations. Those two things are related, but they're not the same thing.
Sounds like a bigger discussion about GDP measurements as well.
It's the same concept. It's some things are really easy to measure, but they're not necessarily what actually matters for people's lives.
I agree. I'm thinking back to when I was a law firm lawyer, and there were people who were there, seemingly 24/7, and then there were people who left earlier. And on the margins, I think demonstrating physical presence can be important, sort of politically in an office setting. But ultimately, the measured outputs are the quality of the work and the quantity, which, for a private sector lawyer is going to be billable hours, but for other occupations, it'll be other things. And that output is really the thing that one tries to maximize. And so focusing on, demonstrating that you're being a productive farmer by having tons of fertilizer on your crops or leaving the light on in your office is, again, it's not that there's no circumstance where that might help convey an impression that benefits somebody, but that's just really no way to design an evaluation metric, especially when there are other metrics, right? So I think it is a little harder to define quote objective accessibility metrics because it's just more multifaceted than how far does this mode of travel move in this amount of time on this distance. But it's not that difficult, right? I mean, maybe Jonathan can speak to some accessibility KPIs, but we're not talking about even decentering the car, for example. That's not really, there are accessibility based ways of planning for automobiles. And like Jonathan said, mobility ways of planning for walking. So we think this is doable.
So where does this work lead you? You've laid down the accessibility gauntlet. What are some of those next steps? What are some things that you want to learn or want to know more about?
A lot of accessibility work in the academic literature focuses on refining and making yet more sophisticated the accessibility metrics. The formulas grow ever bigger and ever more unwieldy for actual practitioners in the field. We don't think that's the limiting factor in accessibility, the quality of the metrics. It's the ability of our institutions to incorporate those metrics and to transform their thinking in transportation and land use terms. So Greg and I are interested in the institutions, including law, that have embedded mobility and what is needed to transform those institutions to incorporate the concept of accessibility and to put it at the center of transportation planning and the transportation aspects of land use planning.
Yeah. So in that theme, how do we improve some of the standards that we've been talking about, right? So for example, professional protections, what would be at least an alternative, if not a substitute, at least a different option that planners could use, different from, say, the Green Book or the MUTCD. And NACTO has been a great resource there. I think also probably some change needs to happen internally at engineering bodies. And I gather that some of that is afoot. I don't want to speak to the speed or extent of that. And I think it probably matters by organization. I have the impression that ITE, for example, is more out in front than some other organizations. But, so accepting that there need to be standards and specifically liability insulation, that's just a practical risk management step. But then thinking about how the content can better reflect the goals of transportation. There are a lot of very weedsy legal questions here, like who has authority over determining whether a building gets built. Even when you invoke something like CEQA, what you're ultimately talking about is a court. That's a statute that's on the books from 50 years ago, but it ends up being invoked by a private plaintiff and then applied by a court. So is that the right level at which to make that decision? Or do you want to have more as of right planning, which is a legislative decision to not delegate that to the courts and to private litigants, but to actually make that choice ex ante at the legislative level? The answer isn't always going to be just do as right. You want to avoid some of the mistakes that the CEQAs of the world were enacted in response to. But there are a lot of questions there. Levels of authority, this is a question lawyers love talking about, at least law professors. Is it optimal for a transit agency, for example, to be run by a city versus a state, or maybe via interstate compact? And what are the pros and cons? I think there are some really interesting theoretical debates there. But not to get too current eventsy again, but we're at a moment where these transit agencies, the big ones, they're in that Wile E. Coyote stage where they haven't. I mean, I think they do know that they're falling, or about to, but they haven't really felt the brunt of the impact of the loss of ridership because they're still coasting on COVID funds for another 3 or 4 years. When they fall, and unless there's a real rearrangement of politics in the short term, it's hard to imagine they won't. Do you think they're going to be happier that they're state funded, or do you think they're going to wish they were city funded? I mean, it's cities that are also bearing the brunt of work from home and the decline in commercial real estate values and lunch receipts, things like that. Cities are going to be in a really big mess fiscally in a few years. I think it's maybe different now than a few years ago. People would say probably it's better that that's largely a state funded enterprise as opposed to city. But there's some just interesting levels of authority, fiscal and legal responsibility allocation questions there.
I guess it depends on who's in charge of the state. Here in California, Gavin Newsom has zeroed out a lot of transit funding because of the budget shortage, which we just gave people a bunch of money as a refund for a gas tax holiday type of thing to, get, which is part of state law, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of reasons why they did it, but there was no rainy day kind of storage of funding, and we're still giving out electric vehicle rebates and things like that. So there's a lot of decisions that come from like an executive, maybe not the state itself, or, kind of those decisions. We'll fight them in the legislature, and I'm sure Scott Wiener will have something to say about it. And then the city of San Francisco is probably going to be in a world of hurt as well because of the downtown situation. But interesting thoughts for sure.
A lot of the forward thinking is coming out of cities as opposed to state level. Cities are a different kind of creation. They understand the absolute need for reform of transportation policies in general and how vital transit is to their very existence. You simply can't accommodate the number of people who need to move around if all those people are in cars. So I'm buoyed by a lot of the thinking that's coming out of cities and city transportation departments.
Well, Wile E. Coyote is holding up the sign at the moment. The rock is not there anymore underneath him. We'll see what happens, whether he falls or not. The paper is First Principles in Transportation Law and Policy. It's actually going to be a book chapter as well. Where can folks find it if they want to check it out and read it and peruse the pages?
Well, I think it'll be linked in the show notes. It's
It
available.
will be linked in the show notes for sure.
There's an ungated free download on SSRN, and you can also just Google us or the title and navigate your way there, but it'll be in the show notes, hopefully. It
will be, yes. Where can folks find you online if you wish to be found?
I'm happy to get an email, jnthnlvn@umich.edu.
I am also happy to chat by email. I'm also on Twitter, for better or worse, at Greg_Shill. That's SHILL. And I would love to connect with people.
Well, Greg and Jonathan, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.